There is something about magic schools that really does attract the mind. That is why it is an enduring and popular concept in games, movies, and books alike. But here's the thing: a university, an academy, an institution of higher learning that is integrated into your city is so much more than just a magic school. It can provide tension and story. It comes with built-in conflicts between the students and the town populace, between the faculty and the government leadership, and between members of the faculty themselves. There is so much potential for drama in any academic institution. So, in this episode of World Building Blueprints, Season 2, let's discuss creating academic institutions for your fantasy city. Welcome to episode 10 of season 2 with your host, Marie Mullaney. The development of educational institutions in general is one of the most transformative phenomena in our development of cities in history, and it started really early in urban development with the temple-centered scribal houses in ancient Mesopotamia. And honestly, we never looked back from there. Now, why do I say these institutions are transformative? Academic centers have consistently functioned as both mirrors and engines of the cities that host them, and understanding that context is essential for any world builder who's looking to construct believable and intellectually rich urban environments. So, as we often do on this channel, let's start with a quick historical speed run of why these institutional academies developed in our world. In early Mesopotamian society, Sumerian temple schools known as Eduba or Tablet House, which is a great name for a school if you're looking for one, represented the earliest organized educational institutions. These schools, managed by priests or senior scribes, prioritized cuneiform writing, administrative law, and basic arithmetic necessary for temple management and accounting. Remember, writing predominantly started because of, well, tax collection. So early education all drives back to keeping track of accounts. That curriculum of Mesopotamia was highly standardized, as evidenced by the surviving cuneiform practice tablet. Heck, one of the reasons why we have the legend of Gilgamesh is because it was used as a practice legend for scribes to learn to write with. Now, this practical state-aligned curriculum prepared young boys, and it was pretty much just boys at that point, over a multi-year training period to assume roles in the state bureaucracy, essentially to become clerks and scribes. And these clerks and scribes made the ancient world run. We see this same model in ancient Egypt as well. Scribal and palace schools operated in tandem with temples and government offices to train your elite administrators, who kept the whole empire running. Later, in the city-states of ancient Greece, education started diverging along ideological lines. In classical Athens, schooling was almost entirely private and market-driven, driven by what people wanted their kids to learn, essentially. Aside from 2 years of compulsory military training, the state played no regular role in schooling. Anyone could open a school, determine their own curriculum, and charge a monthly fee of their pupils. And so teachers who were successful attracted pupils and made more money, and those who were not successful went out of business. This stood in stark contrast to the Spartan agoge, a state-run compulsory system designed to produce physically perfect and obedient warriors. At age 7, Spartan boys were removed from their homes to live in military dormitories under harsh physical discipline, rendering the majority of the population not that literate, but militarily very formidable. And I would like to point out here the difference in aims. In Athens, education was restricted to those who could afford it. It was market-driven, but it was driven by what people wanted to learn as determined by where they spent their money. Sparta, everybody who was a citizen of Sparta, and granted this was a small elite group, but everyone who was a citizen of Sparta was given the same education. And the purpose of this education was to produce more Spartans. And much as I do not want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, it is absolutely true that education is used as a means of transmitting culture. The Spartans understood that. They understood the impact that education has on children who go through that schooling experience, and they applied that education at the state level, whereas the Athenians, while they had their 2 years of military service, allowed a much wider and more unregulated education. Now, I will say that in the end, both of these civilizations were subsumed into other civilizations and so on, but we still remember the Athenian philosophers, not so much the Spartan ones. So, make of that what you will. That being said, I'm also not in favor of education restricted by wealth, so personally, I want to have my cake and eat it too. Sue me. And let's move on to the medieval urban shift and why we moved away from teaching our kids with a single tutor in our homes to schools. Prior to the High Middle Ages, elite education in Europe was largely domestic. Children learned from their parents, if they were in the lower classes, and wealthy landowners employed private tutors and governesses to educate their children within the isolated safety of their estates. So under this home tutoring model, the curriculum was, of course, directly dictated and influenced by the patron family and focused on things like social etiquette and courtly accomplishment and localized military tactics. However, during the 12th and 13th century, rapid urbanization and the expanse of the commercial economy rendered that isolated domestic tutoring model functionally obsolete for the urban elite. There's a couple of factors that drove this obsolescence. The first is the specialization of knowledge. You had Roman law being reintroduced. You had the expansion of canon law. You had the importation of Arabic medical and mathematical treatises into Europe. And all of that required highly specialized instruction. A single domestic tutor could not possess the simultaneous expertise in civil law, in dialectics, in clinical medicine, and in theology. So, it became a case of grouping these kinds of experts together in urban cathedral schools and in our emerging universities in Europe that offered structured faculty of specialized masters. In addition, there was a high cost associated with scholarly infrastructure. Bearing in mind, books were heinously expensive, and education in the medieval period was constrained by the enormous cost of paper, ink, and the labor to create the books. Now, centralized institutions could pool resources to maintain extensive manuscript libraries, and that would offer an infrastructure advantage that all but the wealthiest noble estates lacked. And lastly, the commercial revolution and vocational mathematics also drove the extinction of the personal tutor. And that commercial revolution was driven by the growth of the Mediterranean trade networks that demanded specialized mathematical skills. In the 13th century, following the publication of Leonardo Fibonacci's Liber Abaci in 1202, Italian merchant families realized that traditional Roman numerals were way too cumbersome for calculating international exchange rates and partnership dividends. And so, gradually, over the course of a century or so, they switched away from Roman numerals and to Arabic numerals. And this led to the creation of the Schoola d'Abaco, abacus schools, in hubs like Florence, Venice, and Genoa. These schools were funded either by municipal communes, merchant guilds, or through partnerships with wealthy patrons. Boys aged 10 to 11 spent a couple of years learning practical arithmetic, algebra, and bookkeeping. Merchants and taxes, man, they're going to drive your early education system for sure. Merchants and taxes. Anyway, eventually, schools became far more numerous than paying someone or multiple someones to teach your child whatever that teacher happened to know in your own home. So, that was a brief history of schooling and academics in Europe. But really, while the history is interesting, and I always like to include some of it, the important part is the models of education, right? So, let's compare what academics and universities and so on looked like in Europe, India, and China. There are, of course, similarities between higher learning education institutes in Europe, in India, and in China. You can't have these kinds of organizations and not have similarities. But there are also differences. The medieval Western university was structured as a legal corporation, a universitas, and it was independent of direct municipal control. So these corporations arose as defensive responses to urban instability. Foreign students arriving in cities like Bologna lacked citizenship rights, making them vulnerable to price gouging by landlords, and the right of reprisal, which allowed municipal authorities to seize a foreigner's properties to settle debts incurred by their fellow countrymen, also threatened these students' livelihood. So, in response, foreign law students in Bologna self-organized into mutual aid societies called nations, based on their ethnic heritage. And these nations eventually merge into a unified student-run guild. The student guild hired professors, negotiated their salaries, and enforced a rigorous puncta system of fines to ensure educational quality. Professors were contractually required to pay a financial deposit at the start of the academic year, and if a lecturer arrived late, ran over the lecture hour, or skipped a difficult passage, they were fined directly from that deposit. To monitor these infractions, the student guild selected specific students divided into ultramontanes and cismontanes, those from beyond the Alps and those from the Italian peninsula, to formally denounce errant faculty. Conversely, the University of Paris operated on a master-run guild model, where professors were paid by the church, placing administrative control and curriculum design into the hands of the scholastic hierarchy rather than the student body. To protect these academic guilds, sympathetic rulers granted them pretty extraordinary legal exemptions. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's Constitutio Habitia in 1158 granted scholars traveling for study the legal status of clergymen, or clerici. This benefit of the clergy meant that students and faculty were entirely exempt from civil courts for a whole range of criminal offences. If a student committed a crime governed by this benefit of the clergy, they could only be tried in a lenient ecclesiastical or university court, shielding them from the harsh municipal punishments. These legal immunities, combined with university exemptions from local taxes and civic duties, fueled intense resentment among the non-academic urban population. This friction resulted in frequent, highly destructive town and gown riots. And that is a great name, town and gown riots. It works so well to explain the conflict between the two types of people. Anyway, So in Europe, you have institutions that either self-organize to protect themselves or are protected by high-ranking patrons like the emperor or even by the church. And of course, that would result in some shaping of the curriculum by those patrons, but it's less a direct model of interference, as we'll see next. And speaking of next, let's take a look at the Indian context. A caveat here, I am going to mispronounce these names, I am sorry. Ancient India pioneered two distinct models of higher education that integrated spiritual training, philosophical discourse, and advanced scientific research under varying structures and state patronage. First, there is the Taksalia, dating from at least the 6th century BCE in the Gandhar region in modern Pakistan. Taxila operated as a highly decentralized informal education hub. Positioned at the intersection of Persian, Greek, and Central Asian trade routes, this was not a single centralized campus. Rather, it was a collection of independent teachers who operated their own schools out of their residences or ashrams. Students selected their gurus, as they were called, based on their reputation. Instruction was highly individualized, very similar to the Athenian school system that we spoke about earlier. There were no grand lecture halls or centralized administration or formal degrees awarded upon completion. At the age of 25, after approximately a decade's study, students finished their education, although some specialized scholars continued their research until age 37 or so. The curriculum was pretty broad, training princes, scholars, and merchants in the Vedas, in medicine, in statecraft, and in astronomy. Taxila flourished until its destruction by foreign invaders, particularly the Hunas or White Huns in the 5th century CE. And that takes us to the 5th century CE, when the Nalanda was established in Magadha, which is modern Bihar. Nalanda represented the pinnacle of centralized residential monastic universities. Backed by successive imperial patrons, including the Gupta Empire, King Harsha of Kanayao, and the Pala dynasty, Nalanda grew into a massive institution, housing 10,000 students and 2,000 faculty at its peak, which is a very substantial sum, especially for that time. To sustain this community, imperial patrons remitted the agricultural revenues of over 100 surrounding villages directly to the university. These villages supplied Nalanda's kitchens with their daily food requirements, and it allowed the university to provide free education, lodging, and medicine to all its students. Admissions were obviously, therefore, highly competitive, with candidates subject to rigorous oral exams and only 20 to 30% of applicants gaining entry. And you thought it was just you sweating over your college application. Intellectual life was driven by the practice of shastrastra, formal public debates where scholars defined their philosophical positions against rival schools of thought. So, stating your opinion and defending your opinion, essentially. Sadly, the university was ultimately destroyed in 1193 CE during the Afghan conquest, marking a catastrophic decline in the trans-regional transmission of Buddhist and Sanskrit scholarship. So in India, we see an outgrowth of a strong centralized state supporting university life as opposed to the more guild orientation of the West, where you did not have those strong centralized states to offer that kind of support. But there is an even stronger centralized state in the Far East. So let's talk about Imperial China. If you've been listening to me for a while, you'll have heard me mention before about China's scholarly bureaucratic exams, which came to exist very early on and determined who would become a bureaucrat in China. So, of course, if you have such an exam, there naturally occurs a series of institutions to prepare students to take those exams, right? Of course. The Chinese educational model was defined by a dual-track system. The state-run imperial academies, designed for administrative training and preparing students for the exams, and the semi-private classical academies, which were located in natural retreats. First, let's talk about the Imperial College. And again, I'm sorry about the names. The imperial colleges were established under the Jin dynasties, and it was called the Guozijian. So the Guozijian served as the highest administrative headquarters for state education and the premier seat of learning in the capital cities of the Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties. Its internal governance was highly bureaucratic, managed by state-appointed chancellors, a dean of studies, and a proctor. Under the Jin dynasty, a class-stratified system was implemented, where the Guozijian was reserved exclusively for the sons of high-ranking officials, rank 5 and above, while the Taixu, or National University, educated commoners and tribute students who scored exceptionally well on the local exams. The Guozijian was designed to prepare students for those imperial examinations, which of course selected the state bureaucracy, and thus the curriculum focused intensely on the Confucian classics, specifically the 4 books and the 5 classics, installing a shared ideology and moral code across the empire. Now, let's talk about the second track. Because the state-run schools and the imperial examination system frequently stagnated into rigid rote memorization regimes, independent Neo-Confucian scholars founded the Shu Yuan, again originating in the Tang dynasty as private libraries and imperial compilation centers. The Shuan expanded during the Song dynasty into autonomous educational retreats. Unlike the urban Guozijian, the Suan were built in isolated scenic mountain valleys and forests, such as the Yelu Academy on Mount Yelu and the White Deer Grotto Academy, which is a perfect name. Many of these academies were physically constructed on the sites of former Buddhist monastic schools and incorporated Zen Buddhists' concept of quiet contemplation, scholastic isolation, and communion with nature. Even the physical architecture was defined by the dialogue between the garden and the high wall. The organic flowing garden layout represented natural freedom, artistic expression, and the liberation of the mind. The high stone wall represented humanistic order, social responsibility, and the strict behavioral norms of Confucian ritual propriety. Presided over by a mountain leader or director, these academies rejected exam-orientated cramming and focused on character development, critical interpretation of the classics, and philosophical debates. And they were supported, of course, by their students. So we had the official schools, and then we have the schools that are not official on the side. Now, if we look at these 3 models, we can see that if you are implementing a tertiary education institute, some kind of academy, some kind of a college, your institute will need some kind of patronage system. It is not cheap to maintain an environment of scholars. Athens paid for their schools through market forces. You attracted enough students through one means or another, and those students funded the scholar. India and China both funded education through a strong central state. Europe funded education later either through self-organization using the wealth of foreign students or through relying on the protection and funding of the church, or occasionally nobles, but mostly the church. But either way, you need to figure out who or what faction or organization protects your university type academy and who pays for people to teach in this academy. And once you know that, you will know what influences the curriculum that your scholars teach in this academy. And you will also need to figure out what the relationship is between your academy and the rest of your city. Is it an adversarial relationship or a supportive relationship? Has there been conflict like the town and gown riots? If the central government is supporting your academy, has there been schisms like there were in China? And there are those who have split off from the official approved scholastic curriculum. Has your education system been affected by war like India's was, where they lost the whole education system due to conquest? So there's a lot of threads you can work in here to create potential tension within your city, and that you can generate plot threads to pull on. And you can use these threads to create deep lore for your city. But this is fantasy world building. So next, let's turn our attention to some fantastical examples. However, before we get to those, give me one moment to tell you how you can get even more out of this podcast. Members of the Just in Time World Building YouTube channel get free access to the worksheets on the topics we discuss in these podcasts. From the Build It in Straw tier to the Build It in Stone tier, not only do you get these worksheets, but you also get a monthly members live stream and early access to all my videos. But if you don't want to commit to monthly memberships, you can also purchase the worksheets. If you're interested in the first season's worksheets, buy Worldbuilding Blueprints Volume 1, which is an epic book with color layout and worksheets that will guide you from zero to hero. The digital format of the book is available on my website, as is the hardback and the black and white paperback. The first 100 people who use the code UNI2026, that's UNI 2026, will get 20% off on purchasing the paperback copy from my website. Links to all that down below. All right, let's get back to Fantasy Academies. I'ma blow your mind. Before we talk about any modern examples, before we talk of any university or school stories that have been written, we should talk about scholomance, specifically the Transylvanian scholomance. This is a folklore myth from Romania. Supposedly, the scholomance was hidden in the Carpathian mountains of Hermannstadt, and this legendary school of black magic was said to be run by the devil himself. The school's enrollment was strictly capped at 7, 10, or 13 students, depending on your mythology. These students, known as the Solomonari, lived in subterranean complexes, completely shielded from sunlight, for 9 years of intensive study. The curriculum focused on the language of all living things, natural secrets, and weather manipulation. And the cost of studying here was one heck of a bet. 90% of the graduates returned to the material world with magical powers. Good for them. The other 10% were retained by the devil himself as eternal payment for everybody else's scholarly knowledge. The retained students were transformed into the Weathermakers, or Solomonar, cursed to ride a lake-dwelling dragon through the skies, to brew thunderstorms and cast down lightning. Which, look, I have to tell you, does not sound like that much of a punishment. I could return to the world with magical powers, or I can be transformed into a dragon rider throwing lightning bolts at the earth. I don't know, man. Where do I sign? So, that is the mythology that forms a kind of blueprint for later works. Let's talk about one of the best examples of a school implementation in fantasy writing. And I am talking, of course, about Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea novels and Roke Island. In the Earthsea cycle, Le Guin establishes a model of magical schooling that rejects the flashy, combative spellcasting in favor of philosophically grounded systems. The School of Wizardry on Roke Island is situated in the town of Thule, near Roke Knoll and the Imminent Grove, a living forest that contains the primal foundations of the world. The school's curriculum is built around the concept of balance or equilibrium, reflecting an almost Taoist approach, where magic is not a weapon of dominance, but a deep responsibility to preserve the natural order. The school is governed by an archmage and 9 masters of Roke, each representing a specialized branch of magical science. Le Guin's world building incorporates a very realistic historical prejudices. For example, women were permanently excluded from Roke. This created a rigid gender divide, segregating institutional male-dominated high magic from the denigrated, localized witchcraft practiced by women in the outer islands. And it's something worth considering in your world. What prejudices does your school have? Who does it exclude? And what does it mean for those people to be excluded? In my opinion, Roke is one of the greatest magic school stories ever written, and I recommend it to all and sundry. But it is not the only one. So let's talk about a more recent example, that of Patrick Rothfuss's university. In the King Killer Chronicle, Patrick Rothfuss strips the fantasy magic school of its academic safety and depicts it as a highly competitive and economically realistic university. Located across the river from the town Imri, Rothfuss's university functions pretty much like a corporation. The most innovative aspect of Rothfuss's world building is the integration of magical theory into the local industrial economy. In The Fishery, the university's research and manufacturing wing, students use the thermodynamic-style rules of sympathy, his magic system, to design and produce commercial products such as kinetic lamps, heating rods, and physical wards. The university operates as a semi-for-profit corporate body. It holds patents on those designs, it manufactures them on site, and it takes a significant cut of the profits to fund its global acquisitions of rare manuscripts for its library, the archives. Rothfuss also introduces a cutthroat tuition system that drives his whole story's socio-economic tension. At the end of every semester, each student must sit for a public oral examination before the Council of 9 Masters. 9 is a very popular number for magical masters. Anyway, based on the students' answers during this examination, their academic performance, and the personal animosity or favor of the examining faculty, each student is assigned a customized tuition rate for the next term. Kind of variable pricing, you know what I'm saying? Brilliant students who please the masters pay nominal fees, while students who make errors or provoke the animosity of influential masters are charged astronomical fees. For our very improvised protagonist, Kothe, this system creates a continual threat of academic suspension, which creates a great deal of tension in the story. So, when you are creating the magical side of your academy, your fantastical university, what you want to think about is this. How does your magic system integrate? Do people come here to learn the magic system as they do with Roke and to learn the philosophies of how to use magic properly? Is there anybody who is excluded from the university as women are excluded in the Earthsea books? Is there any prejudice attached to going to the university? Do you have to prove yourself capable of magic before you can attend? How does the admission work? Then think about how a university integrates within your world, the way Rothfuss did through economics. Does the university invent new magic? Do they study magic like a thing that can be researched? Do they debate the ethical use of magic? Do they come up with new guidelines on how to use magic and the moral choices that are faced by magicians? Are disciplines other than magic taught at the university? And how does that integrate with the normal faculty? These are all great questions to ask when constructing the fantasy side of your academies. So, pulling all this together, what you want to do when you're building out an academy is first consider its historical origins and its legal architecture. What was the catalyst that led to its foundation? Who founded the school, and what values are they said to have championed for that school? And of course, conversely, what is the historical reality? What were the actual socio-economic and political catalysts that forced the school's creation? For example, was there a massive administrative need so that the state sponsored the creation of the school? Was there a drive to explore the natural world? So there were scholars who attracted students to be taught, and those students fund the scholars. Was there a religious requirement? So there is sponsorship by the church. Whatever it was that creates your academy will influence the curriculum and the feel of your academy. Then consider the jurisdictional borders. What legal shields do scholars and students possess? Are they immune to the local city guard? And if so, who polices student misconduct? And what tensions exist between the guard and the student body? And don't forget those town and gown friction points. How does the local urban population view the academy? Then you want to think about your economic engine and your demographics. How is the academy funded, and what influence does that have on your scholarship and on the curriculum? Is tuition uniform, or is it variable based on academic exams, family background, or personal or political influence? Then you're going to want to think about the student body demographics. Who are selected to attend, and how are they selected? What are the admission rates? Are there any people who are automatically excluded? Also, how is the student body actually organized? Are there distinct cohorts based on social class or specialized majors or some sort of guild competition? And then thirdly, you want to consider your institutional governance and your curriculum, taking into consideration all of the things we've talked about. Who makes the final administrative and financial decisions of the academy? Is it run by a state-appointed chancellor or a council of specialized masters? Probably 9 of them if you use masters. That does seem to be tradition. Or is there a self-organizing guild of paying students who set the curricula? Then consider what specialized colleges and subject matters are included, including magic or other fantastical studies, things like a bardic college, a healer's college, a mage's college, etc. And then fourthly, consider your actual campus environment. What is the campus layout like? Is it like the schools in China, where you have the garden area and the wall area, and that represents your teaching philosophy? Is it some kind of sprawling medieval building attached to a monastery and built through church money? Is teaching conducted outdoors the way that some Athenian scholars taught their students? Or is it just a collection of scholars who grouped together at the crossroads the way they did in India? What does the actual university look like, and how does it work hand in glove with your magic system and the philosophy of the school? Are there any physical or magical barriers that separate the organized safety of the academy from the outside world? Where do students sleep, eat, and socialize? How comfortable are these living quarters? And what materials do students use to study? For example, parchment, reusable wax tablets, customized mathematical abacuses, some kind of magical devices, or other components. And how do poorer students obtain these necessary tools for their studies at this prestigious institute? And those are my thoughts on academies in fantasy worlds. Make sure you hit subscribe if you want to be notified about next month's podcast, where we speak about specialized organizations like the infamous Adventurer Guild and whether you can have one. Let me know your favorite university, fantasy or real, in the comments. Hit the thumbs up button and the hype button if you're on mobile and all those other good buttons. If you want to financially support the podcast, check out the Kickstarter for my latest fiction book, which is currently in its pre-launch phase, or consider becoming a member of the Just in Time World Building channel. I very much appreciate all of my members who keep my cats fed, and all their names are currently on screen. And I will see you soon for another episode of World Building Blueprints, where we build what we need when we need it.